I'm Diane Stradling, and this week the Army Benevolent Fund continues to mark the 80th anniversary of VJ Day and the end of the Second World War on the 15th of August 1945. This may be a pub, but this is Al Murray historian, not pub landlord, and he reflects on the Allied army of nearly 1 million soldiers, including his great-uncle, from more than a dozen countries that fought in the punishing Burma campaign, yet became the Forgotten Army.
Oh, why is it the Forgotten Army? Well, I think the fact that the Burma theatre, the India theatre, is so far from here. It's literally the other side of the world. And also, what are we fighting for in Burma? We're fighting to defend the British Empire, defend India, really. It's not got the immediate thing of we're defending the homeland from the German aggressor. It's not got that context to it. In fact, the politics is much more complicated, and the consequential politics that follow the campaign is much more complicated than simply we're fighting to free Europe from the Nazis. There's much more going on in it, and I think that just puts a distance between us and that theatre that's baked in with the geographical distance, but then the politics makes that more complicated.
And it was a war that was much more difficult for people at home to even begin to understand.
The distances involved are enormous, and I think they're one of the reasons it's hard to get your head around the campaign. You know, they're fighting hundreds and hundreds of miles from India once they get into Burma. Distances that in Europe are the width of the map of Europe. You know, and that I think makes it hard to grasp in your imagination, really difficult.
And the last part about the actual word forgotten is I read somewhere quite recently, or may even have heard it on a podcast quite recently, that the soldiers, when they eventually came home, were told not to talk about it. And that was something that didn't happen on VE Day, and the people that were repatriated after that. There was huge celebrations. It was silence.
Yes, there was a really different attitude to people who, when they got home, who'd fought in Burma and in the Far East. After all, the way prisoners of war had been treated, for instance, was so diabolical, so appalling, that actually, to be able to move on, I think, as a society, there was a it's the style of the time. There was a need to keep the lid on that and to keep that dark and not talk about it. And so that also adds to the fact that the campaign is forgotten about. And the other element, of course, is that it's the Indian Army, and that there's millions of people involved in the struggle in Burma, but not all of them are British. You know, they're a sliver of the people who are involved, and it's Indians, it's West Africans, it's people from all over the British Empire who are fighting in Burma, and rather than just British battalions like in Northwest Europe.
It probably is the first and probably only occasion where you would get as many different Commonwealth troops together, because, as you say, it was African nations, it was Australia, New Zealand, and Americans as well, of course.
Well, it's the most extraordinary composition of people fighting in Burma. I mean, as well as the Indian Army, which is people from all over India. And after all, the British had different views of the different peoples in India and how they could recruit them and whether they could recruit them and how they would involve them, how they would motivate them to fight against the Japanese. There's all that going on. And there's people from Africa, African nations. And there's, we call it, on our podcast, we call it Duke, Dominion's UK Empire, because you've got the different people from different elements. And the Americans are fighting, or rather running, a Chinese army in Burma as well. So you do have these extraordinary moments of British soldiers fighting with Chinese guns backing them and American aircraft helping them out. That this is actually properly combined Allied effort. But of course, China, after the war, is no longer our ally, falls away after the revolution. So we're not going to remember that, are we? And the Americans were very ambivalent about the Burma campaign anyway, because they saw it as fighting to save the British Empire, which they're not keen on. So, again, we come back to the politics.
And of course, with India, it wasn't very long in our empire after.
Well, what is really, really interesting about the Burma conflict is why did people fight? Why did Indian people fight there. What for? And there's all sorts of reasons people become soldiers. And, I'm telling the Army Benevolent Fund that, there's lots of different motivations. But what you have is a war of imperial aggression by the Japanese. And Indian people respond to defending themselves. But the deal is it's going to end. Not only that they're going to destroy the Japanese Empire, but they're going to wind down the British Empire. And the British Empire that's the bargain, is that come the end of the war, India will get its independence. And so there's a very, 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 for a lot of people, a very, very clear bargain about why they're fighting. There's a deal on that's there on the table, and the British then have to honour it, of course.
And that wasn't quite the case with some of the African.
No, I mean,
regiments.
who knows? Who knows why people from Africa are fighting in Burma for the British in the Second World War? I mean, all the reasons soldiers fight. Again, pay, adventure, travel. There's nothing, the unemployment. I mean, whatever the recruiting sergeants were, for African soldiers. I mean, it's one of the great, truly forgotten parts of the Second World War. We've forgotten our own history in Burma, but there's other people's history in Burma that sometimes gets left to one side because we're looking at our own.
And there's an extraordinary level of commitment and courage and unexpected heroism with people, as you say, who know very little about the British Army in some ways. I mean, wasn't there someone who won a medal and then said, sorry, what is that?
Oh, yes. I mean, when you have Indian soldiers winning the Victoria Cross with no idea what the Victoria Cross is, I mean, that does happen. But the fighting is particularly brutal. I mean, I think one of the things that is perhaps, again, different to Northwest Europe or to the European campaigns is the Japanese are absolutely dedicated to not surrendering. They will fight to the last round, the last man. They will, you have lots of instances of them killing themselves rather than surrender. And right at the core of the fighting, particularly on the British and Indian side, is this idea that you don't let the Japanese army get hold of your wounded because terrible things will happen to them. And my great uncle fought in the 10th Gloucesters, and he was killed rescuing wounded because killed by a sniper trying to recover the wounded because he knew he couldn't let them fall into the hands of the enemy. And there's a character to the fighting in Burma and in fact all of the encounters everyone's having with the Japanese during the war that is it's on a different scale to what's happening in Europe. Yes, the Germans die hard, but the Japanese die even harder, and that means every last encounter, some poor sod has got to go in there and get them out of that bunker or wheedle them out of that emplacement, and it's really, really horrible and bitter.
I mean, brutal fighting.
Yeah.
But the thing that I found overwhelming was the number of conflict casualties compared to health casualties, if you like. I mean, just tell us a little bit about that.
Well, this is the other characteristic of the fighting in Burma is the environment is so hostile. And so in 1942, the Japanese raced through Burma and forced the British and Indian armies out of Burma. And there's this idea that they somehow know how to operate in the jungle, and that the jungle is sort of hostile, is the feeling the British and the Indian army have, that the jungle's hostile to them. And then they figure out, actually, the jungle's hostile to everybody, right? It's as hostile to the Japanese as it is to you, right? And the opportunities for sickness, for illness. There's a period in October 44, if I remember rightly, I think 14th Army have sort of 600 battle casualties, but 25,000 people or something have got malaria. I may even have that number wrong by an order of double, right? There's this incredible problem with jungle sickness, with ticks, with leeches, with jungle sores, because the atmosphere is so humid and hot. If you cut your leg, you'll get an infection. And there's this endless, relentless problem with sickness. And so all the time, infantry battalions, for instance, are grappling with the fact that the men are sick. And what do you do with a malaria casualty? Do you send him all the way? Do you fly him all the way back out to India? We think of casualty evacuation, from the Army's recent experiences, back to Bastion or whatever. But this is like flying people back hundreds of miles to India to get them to recover. And what in the end Bill Slim, who's the General Commanding 14th Army, decides to do is we'll treat them in the immediate rear area rather than send them home. Give them some rest, fix them up, turn them around, send them back, because otherwise you lose people to sickness as well as the fighting. And 10th Gloucesters, for instance, when they go up in the line in the fight down to Pinway, at one point they stop because and that's an infantry battalion that ought to number about 800 people. They're down to a couple of hundred guys because everyone's got malaria, and it's this. It's absolutely incredible, and that an army's it's a multinational army in every aspect. So officers need to be able to run ration scales for lots of different religions and national requirements and temperaments. Right? They've also got to probably master lots of different languages, Urdu at least, all the other languages that they might need at their disposal. They're also dealing with, Indian soldiers who want promotion, and there's the issue of, do you promote Indian people? Well, of course you do if they're good, but then what do you do after the war with those people? How are you going to reward them? All these issues all at once, and then the problems of the illnesses that come with the jungle.
We say that we do these occasional sort of films and podcasts and things, which are, from our perspective, to honour those who's gone. Yeah. Remembrance is a big thing, obviously, for us. And we always say, we're there from cradle to grave, but we're there to remember those, who not only who made the ultimate sacrifice, but made a sacrifice in every way.
If you go to war for 5 years, you put your life on hold, you don't see your children growing up. Obviously there are people who make the ultimate sacrifice, but it's your life that you've handed over to the army.
Do you think that those who served in Burma had obviously a very different war experience than that? Do they in some ways demand our respect more, or what are your thoughts about them as?
Well, that's a very difficult question to answer. Do the people who fought in Burma? I think the thing is when you start to nose into any of the theatres and look at the conditions, the conditions in Italy, the winter of 43, 44 in Italy, that winter is absolutely the weather is diabolical. It's appalling, and you do get the feeling the army. Some of the planners have thought, well, the weather will be fine. They haven't got their heads around what Italian winters are like. So when you look at that, you think, okay, fine, and they're fighting, and the fighting's difficult, and the Germans are being very, very stubborn. And then, the winter of 1944, 45 in Northwest Europe is appalling, also. But there is something about the jungle. There is something about the conditions in Burma, particularly, where you think the simple endurance of the day-to-day existence. And also the distance, will you get your mail? Will the mail come? Will you hear from home? Will you be able to write home? Will they ever know what you're going through? And of course, the style of the time is to write home going, don't worry about me, which I think is probably the same now. Don't worry about me, I'll be all right. And you've got people writing that home, and they're in the swirl of they're in a terrible place where no people should be, there's still parts of Burma that are essentially uninhabited because it's uninhabitable. I do think respect is probably, I probably on balance think the people who fought in Burma, they need remembering for the endurance of what they went through, if nothing else.
And do you understand the drive to set up the Army Benevolent Fund, given what had happened to returning soldiers after World War I?
Well, the really, really interesting thing is that in so much of the Second World War, people talk about the Second World War as the reaction to the First World War. The politics that brings the Second World War about is the result of the First World War and the unsatisfactory outcome at the end of the First World War. For everybody, really. The army fights the war with a load of officers who'd learned the lessons of the First World War. Monty was a casualty in the First World War, shot through the lungs, had to recover. The man who came to rescue him was killed and lay upon him overnight. So he knew exactly what the price of soldiering was, what the cost of being a soldier was.
We owe a debt to these men and to the families of those who have fallen. Let us not forget that debt.
So much the high politics of the war, the welfare state, the National Health Service, the deal that the Labour government offered people at the end of the war is to make sure that land fit for heroes promises that were made in the First World War would come more true. And you can completely see why you would have a thing like the Army Benevolent Fund. And the date of its foundation, I think, is really, really interesting. It's the end of the Normandy campaign. It's the end of the worst fighting that the British Army endured in the Second World War. The casualty rate, if you're an infantryman or an armoured soldier, is the same as the First World War battlefields in Normandy. You've lads writing home going, "Don't worry, Dad, I know you had it worse in the First World War." So you can completely see why you would, because the Legion comes after the First World War, but you need to set up a fund during the conflict to say, we do worry about you and we do care about you. And I think it's really interesting that it's Monty, because Monty's thing was he cared for his soldiers. He really, really cared about his men. And that's because he knew if he didn't, he'd never get them to do the things he wanted them to do. And the war would be that much harder to fight. And I think, what's remarkable about the Second World War is it's a civilian army. It's people like me, right? And I have immense respect for anyone who's joined the army, because it basically meant I didn't have to, right? But when the balloon goes up, people like me may have to. And luckily I'm too old and unfit to make the grade. But the point is they understood they understood this in a way that I think we've forgotten as well. That this was a war that required the whole of society to get involved. And so you had to treat the soldier as a valued citizen and not Tommy Atkins, and that's why you have a benevolent fund. That's why there's the Army Benevolent Fund.